Okay, Peter, so I exist, you exist, and the universe exists. Why does anything exist at all? And more importantly, is this even a legitimate question to ask in the first place?
Well, I think it's a legitimate question if it's a request for understanding. Clearly, when you explain things, you say one thing in order to understand another thing, and so you're not going to explain why everything exists, because any explanation is in terms of something else that has to exist. But as regards understanding, I think it's a perfectly good question. I don't hold out much hope, in this life at least, for understanding why there's anything rather than nothing. Aquinas might be right. I mean, Aquinas thought that in an afterlife we might be able to see that God just has to exist. But I don't think there's anything like that in this life. And although I think it's a perfectly good question, I doubt whether we're going to have an answer.
Okay.
But there's a related question. And the related question, which does concern metaphysicians a lot, is why does anything exist that might not have existed? Why does anything exist that comes into existence? And that's a fairly sort of standard issue in which you try to find some necessary thing, maybe the laws of nature or maybe God or whatever, that space and time itself, something that has always been there and just has to exist. So I think that second question is more likely to be answered than the first. But it's a perfectly good question.
Okay. Okay, now, because there's been certain disputes in philosophy in terms of this question. Some people, as yourself, argue that it is a legitimate question. Others argue that it makes grammatical and lexical sense, but really that it doesn't postulate any categories for a potential answer. But at this moment, you believe it is a viable question, at least for getting at some form of understanding in a reductive sense of ongoing explanations. Now, how does necessity and possibility play into this?
Well, I think there's a bit of confusion here, because one sort of necessity is where we cannot even make sense of, we cannot conceive of an alternative. And you might say the necessity of 2 + 2 = 4 is like that. We just can't get our minds around an alternative. Now, anything that's necessary in that sense, we can understand why it exists. But I don't know of anything that's necessary in the sense that we can't conceive of it not existing. That was the sort of point Hume made. Now, of course, there are many other senses of necessity, and there are senses in which we might well say, if you're a naturalist, you might well say the laws of nature are necessary. If you're a theist, like myself, you might say, no, God made the laws of nature, but God is necessary. But those sorts of necessities aren't the sort where you can't conceive of it, you can't think of it not being the case. I mean, if you couldn't think of God not being the case, the atheist would just be confused. And I don't believe atheists are confused, I just believe they're wrong. Likewise, if the laws of nature, if you couldn't think of them being otherwise, then people who held the laws of nature were different, people like, say, Newton, from the way they actually are, would somehow be confused. And I don't believe that's so. So there's this other sense of necessity, which is very important, things that are metaphysically necessary, as we say. And as I said, the naturalist will say the laws of nature are metaphysically necessary. The theist can say that God is metaphysically necessary. But simply saying something is metaphysically necessary doesn't enable us to understand it. To understand it, you'd have to somehow see that it was metaphysically necessary.
Okay, so you're saying even if it's metaphysically necessary, that still doesn't help us understand it. So whether it's just the laws of nature that are necessary, or whether it's a theistic explanation that are necessary, it couldn't be any other way, but it still doesn't help us understand the nature of existence.
Not unless we can see that it couldn't be any other way. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Now, what in terms of obviously this plays into contingency and possibility. What about um, the simple notion to a certain extent, if you believe that there's a theistic explanation for the universe that can either be necessary or not, i.e. God had to exist, therefore this is why we have a universe that exists, or God did not necessarily have to exist, but he made a choice in terms of creating other forms of existence, which are ourselves. In terms of possibility, how far can we get in terms of just saying that because this was possible, it meant it could have happened and it just has happened?
Well, there's so much that could have happened that simply saying it could have happened and it just has happened doesn't seem to me to explain anything. I said that there's a related question, the question of why there's anything that just comes into existence. And there you've got the prospect of explaining the things that just come into existence, that don't exist at all times, in terms of something that has always existed and indeed has to exist. And there I think you've got a genuine answer to the question of why there are contingent things that just happen to exist but might not have existed. That's a more pressing question. It's not as deep a question, but it's a more pressing question than the one you started with. Why there's anything rather than nothing. Why is there anything that just is contingent? Well, you can explain that in terms of some necessary being, I believe. And I think if you have suitable rules, they could explain why there is space and time, etc. in the first place. Likewise, if you believe in God as a necessary being, as I do, that can explain why there is the things have to exist. So that more limited question, I think, does involve necessity. Simply saying these things are possible, so they might have existed, doesn't strike me as much of an explanation at all, but there is one in the vicinity.
Okay. So, Peter, continue.
Yeah, there's one in the vicinity, and it's this. You might say that possible worlds have to exist. Now, that's a contentious issue in metaphysics, but you might, David Lewis was a very famous proponent of this view, but you might say one way or another that not merely the actual things exist and they don't have to exist, or at least they don't have to be actual, but that all these possible things exist. Now, if you believe that, and it is a rather startling claim, then you can go on to say, well, the possibilities themselves are necessary. They're not necessarily actual, but they're necessarily possible. That's generally agreed, that if something's possible, it's necessarily possible. So if you can somehow explain things in terms of all this vast array, this plenitude of possibilities, then indeed you have something that's necessary and the array of possibilities. So that's the explanation that I said was in the vicinity of saying, well, it's possible. Merely saying it's possible doesn't seem to explain anything. But if, with a bit of metaphysical sleight of hand or ingenuity, you can somehow explain why there are the things that are actual in terms of all the things that are possible, then you have answered the question. And I mentioned David Lewis, and I disagree with him on some rather important details, but given his view of the matter, he can answer the question, because he can say necessarily there are all these possible worlds, and how do we explain why world is actual? Because according to David Lewis, the actual world is just a possible world you happen to be in. Now that's an explanation, I don't accept it, but that's an explanation of why there is anything actual, given as your starting point that there are all these possible worlds, because then the possible worlds are necessary. There can't be any more or less possibilities, on David Lewis's view anyway. And if you just ask, why is there anything actual? Well, it's just the world we happen to be in. Now, I think that has some alarming consequences and is highly counterintuitive, but it would be an answer to the question. And the fact that there are answers to the question, even if I disagree with them, is one of the reasons I think it was a sensible question in the first place. You know, if you've got a sensible answer, it must be a sensible question.
Sure. So even if we're taking necessity and possibility, and we've got a set of actual possibilities that may have occurred, we still may run into the issue that all those actual possibilities may actually turn out to be necessary possibilities. So, for example, if you've got multiverses and we happen to live in one of the multiverses where the laws of nature were possible to be this way, then that's just one in a whole multitude of variations in laws of nature. Yet for this universe that we occupy to be possible, then that has to be a possibility in the first place, which then brings you back to the issue of whether you need necessary possibilities.
Well, if you grant there are things that are merely possible, if you grant this, then I don't think it's that controversial to say that considered as possibilities, they are necessary. Of course, what's not necessary is which one is actual. And that's where David Lewis had a clever answer, but one that I don't think can be correct. That the actual is just whichever one we're in. So according to David Lewis, there's a possible world in which there are small g gods, Athene and Zeus and Aphrodite and so on. These are all possible worlds according to David Lewis, and if you were in one of those possible worlds, that world would be actual for you, so there actually would be these small g gods like Zeus and Aphrodite and Athene and so on. Now, I think most of us find that an incredible view. Moreover, some people, including myself, have produced arguments against it, but that's an example where you can see how if you granted there were all these possible worlds, then they're not necessarily actual, but they're necessarily possible. They have to exist as possible worlds.
Yeah, they have to exist in the first place in some form.
Possible world.
Yeah, sure. Can I just get your take, not to put you on the spot so much here, Peter, but what do you think in your opinion? Obviously, you disagree with aspects of David Lewis's proposal and you find some of them counterintuitive. From your expertise, what do you feel is the best way to approach answering this question, and something that makes more logical sense for you in terms of why there's any form of existence at all?
Well, it's difficult, but my speculation, and look, I want to emphasize that metaphysics is speculative. We just come up with hypotheses. It's not really like science. But my speculation, for what it's worth, is that the difference between the possible and the merely actual is that there is consciousness in the actual worlds, not in the merely possible worlds. So there might be many actual worlds in which there are conscious beings. So what I think is the case is that they're all physical possibilities, but that only some of these worlds have conscious beings. Now, that doesn't go as far as David Lewis towards explaining why there is consciousnness. That is taken as a mystery, just something we have to accept, that there is consciousness. But as regards the explanation of the physical world, I'm inclined to go along with David Lewis and say that, well, there are all these possible physical universes, and what marks the actual is that, as it were, consciousness has focused its attention